Good evening, everyone. I am Edgardo J. Nogot. I will be presenting the conclusion toward a new public sphere. The chapter started out with the quotation from Herbert Cole. Cole's quotation is important because it raises significant questions about the nature of schooling and the role that teachers might play in the building of a more democratic society. Implicit in his remarks is the assumption that schools are marked by contradictions and struggles which also contain the possibilities for emancipatory practice. But in this case, there is an important qualification. The roles that schools and teachers might have in developing radical modes of pedagogy can only be understood within the broader historical, social, and economic conditions that characterize the wider society. Hall's further development of this assumption is correct on two fronts. First, schools cannot by themselves change society. Second, teachers have a dual role to play in the struggle for a new society. That is, they can work both within and outside of schools to help illuminate both the value and the limitations of radical teaching. Within this dialectic of domination and resistance and the contradictory experiences and meanings that schools provide for political work, there exists a theoretical gap regarding the value and limitations of a critical pedagogy, whose aim is the transformation of society and the relations of everyday life. The answers to such questions will not be found in the theoretical legacies that constitute either the dominant or radical discourses on schooling. Radical theorists have made important contributions to unraveling the relations between schools and the dominant society. But in the long run, they have failed to escape either from a crushing pessimism or from the inability to link in a dialectical fashion the issue of agency and structure. They have established the groundwork for a pedagogy that often disables rather than enables emancipatory hopes and strategies. Thus, it is particularly essential for the development of radical theories of schooling to move from questions of social and cultural reproductions to issues of social and cultural production, from the question of how society gets reproduced in the interest of capital and its institutions to the question of how the excluded majorities have and can develop institutions, values, and practices that serve their autonomous interests. It is crucial that a critical discourse be established around the distinction between radical forms of schooling and radical modes of education, both of which are essential to the development of civic courage and the public sphere. In other words, radical pedagogy needs a discourse that illuminates the ideological and material conditions necessary to promote critical modes of schooling and alternative modes of education for the working class and other groups that bear the brunt of political and economic oppression. The starting point for such a discourse centers around the notion of the public sphere and the implications this has for radical pedagogy and political struggle both within and outside of the schools. Historically, the public sphere arose during the early stages of capitalism in the 17th century and originally represented those ideological and material spaces constructed by the bourgeoisie to interpret, reason, and mediate through rationally informed discourse questions of culture and everyday life, and questions of politics and the state. The value of the public sphere in its classical liberal form rested in its definition and function as an instrument of political change and emancipation. That is, as a set of practices, institutions, and values, it provided a mediating space between the state and private existence. Moreover, it was rooted in an interest aimed at promoting emancipatory processes through collective self-reflection and discourse. The liberal public sphere, in one sense, can be understood as a specific form of political practice that rates as its central concern the organizing of a human experience so as to enable individuals to formulate interpretations of social reality in a critical, emancipatory fashion. As an ideal, it posits the need for the ideological and cultural conditions necessary for active citizenship. That is, it signifies the need for an enlightened citizenry able to rationalize power through the medium of public discussion under conditions free from domination. As a referent for critique, it calls into question the gap between the promise and the reality of the existing liberal public spheres. In one sense, the concept of the public sphere reveals the degree to which culture has become a commodity to be consumed and produced as part of the logic of reification rather than in the interest of enlightenment and self-determination. Rooted in market interests and benefiting the process of capital accumulation, culture no longer serves as the object of discussion, specifically as a vehicle for individual and social critique. Instead, it has become a commodity and is consumed accordingly as leisure time activity. Its goal is to reproduce labor power. It is equally important to recognize that the structural alterations of capitalist societies in the West during the 19th and 20th centuries has vitiated, in great part, the conditions for a democratic public sphere. Formal democracy has subsumed substantive democracy in bourgeois society. And behind the facade of elections and plebiscites hide economic and political interests that depoliticize the masses while simultaneously exploiting them. Collective discussions have given way to publicity campaigns, advertisements, and other forms of legitimation. Furthermore, class, gender, and racial inequalities vitiate the possibilities for unrestricted discourse and the possibility for all social groups to participate in public life in accordance with their self-conscious interests. As a referent for social transformation, the public sphere provides new opportunities for reformulating the dialectical relationship between the socio-cultural realms and the power manifested in the state and the control of the means of production. In other words, it constitutes the socio-cultural realm of society as an important terrain in the ideological battle for the appropriation of the state, the economy, and the transformation of everyday life. Schools will have to be seen as only one significant site, providing an opening for revealing capitalist and other oppressive ideologies and for reconstructing more emancipatory relations. For teachers, this suggests developing a critical understanding of those economic and political interests outside of schools that directly infringe upon the processes of schooling via policy enactments, the distribution of resources, and tax cuts. Struggles within the schools have to be understood and linked to alliances and social formations which can affect policy decisions relating to the control and content of schooling. In effect, radical teachers will have to establish organic connections with those excluded majorities who inhabit the neighborhoods, towns, and cities in which schools are located. On the other hand, such an alliance points to the need to get working-class people, minorities of color, and women actively involved in the shaping of school policies and experiences. Rather than being the object of school policy, these groups must become the subject of such policy making. Moreover, although such a view runs counter to the conservative logic of teacher professionalism and expertise, it provides new possibilities for democratizing the schools and broadening the opportunities for community support of teacher struggles. On the other hand, radical teachers will have to be deeply involved in struggles outside of the apparatuses of the state to develop alternative public spheres and counter-educational institutions that provide the conditions and issues around which people could organize in ways that reflect their own needs and actual experiences. Radical pedagogues will have to abandon the traditional leftist policy of treating the oppressed within the boundaries of a unitary discourse. They will have to insert the notion of the concrete back into a theory of radical pedagogy and rate seriously the specific needs, problems, and concerns of everyday life. The point is to link the personal and the political so as to understand how power is reproduced, mediated, and resisted at the level of daily existence. Inherent in such an understanding are the theoretical elements of a cultural politics that establishes the preconditions for alternative public spheres. For radical pedagogues, the dual role that emerges out of this analysis centers around a distinction between education and schooling. In effect, this distinction speaks not only to different regions or spheres of struggles, but it also points to different methods of inquiry and social practices. Education has a direct link to the creation of alternative public spheres, and it represents both an ideal and a strategy in the service of struggling for social and economic democracy. As the embodiment of an ideal, it refers to the forms of learning and action based on commitment to the elimination of forms of class, racial, and gender oppression. As a mode of intellectual development and growth, its focus is political in the broadest sense. Education deals with needs and issues that arise from the groups involved, while simultaneously drawing upon theoretical constructs that allow the participants to situate such issues within a wider historical, social, and economic context. In other words, education takes place outside of established institutions and spheres. Moreover, it represents a collectively produced set of experiences organized around issues and concerns that allow for a critical understanding of everyday oppression, while at the same time providing the knowledge and social relations that become the foundation for struggling against such oppression. In effect, education represents the central strategy or category in the development of alternative public spheres. It refers to critics or critique and the restructuring of social experiences based on new forms of communicative interaction and the reappropriation of cultural modes of communication. As a mode of production, education combats the influence of the school, the workplace, and mass culture in destroying critical sensibilities. As part of an alternative public sphere, it organizes and uses, where possible, the technology of science and the mass media to promote dialogue and democratic forms of communication. Situating the technology of science and the mass media in new social relations also becomes part of the task of providing a new ideology and view of the world to others in the wider society. Teachers must act not simply as teachers, but as citizens or as radical educators, struggling to establish a social and economic democracy. As radical educators, we can help destroy the myths that education and schooling are the same phenomenon. We can debunk the notion that expertise and academic credentials are the primary qualifications of the intellectual, and equally important, provide, discuss, and learn from historical and contemporary examples in which working class people and others have come together to create alternative public spheres. Clearly, the elements of a democratic pedagogy can be exhibited not only through the social relations that radical educators may help to establish, but also through an examination of historically specific examples in the various organizations, clubs, cultural activities, and media productions developed by, for instance, the English working class in the 19th century and 20th century, or the traditions of worker education developed in the United States throughout the beginning of the 28th century, and others. Such educational work would also promote critical analysis of schooling itself and its relation to other institutions included in the liberal public sphere. All too often, the theory and practice relation has been recycled on the terrain of political pedagogy so as to reproduce the division between conception and execution. Teachers and other such intellectuals are seen as theorists, and the people who are alleged to benefit from such theorizing are the objects and agents of practice. Such a view is demeaning to the concept of radical pedagogy and struggle, and it suffers from a thorough misunderstanding about how human agents mediate and act on the world. In effect, it fails to comprehend that people in a different structural and social positions are constantly theorizing at different levels of abstraction and within different sets of ideological assumptions and discourses about the nature of social reality. That is, the interface between theory and practice is not at the same point where radicals provide prescriptions and patents, workers and the oppressed receive and utilize them. Instead, it is at the point where these various groups come together and raise the fundamental question of how they may enlighten each other, and how through such an exchange of theoretical position a mode of practice might emerge in which all groups may benefit. This is not meant to suggest that all theories should be given equal weight. Such a view is a form of relativistic nonsense. It does mean that the human subject should be reintroduced into the process of theorizing. The truth claims of specific theoretical perspectives have to be analyzed and mediated through dialogue and democratic social relations. Central to such a process is the fundamental notion of critique, a notion that should inform such exchanges and processes. More specifically, critics should be organized around historical and sociological modes of analysis. That is, the self and the wider society must be understood as socially constructed and historically constituted through social practices that are contradictory in nature but anchored in a totality of dialectical relation, specifically society. Moreover, analysis of the social, political, and economic conditions that characterize a given society and the constraints they promote should be judged against ethical concerns regarding whether the existing totality of relation in such a society should be sustained or transformed. Finally, the processes that inform theory and practice within the parameters of an alternative public sphere have to be grounded in a notion of transcendence. Transcendence speaks to an affirmative vision regarding the development of a new society, a democratic notion of sociability, and the development of social conditions that maximize individual and social possibilities to expand the rich individuality of all people. Schools are formal institutions directly or indirectly linked to the state through public funding or through certification requirements. Within these institutions, individuals assuming the role of radical teacher often find themselves working within structural and ideological constraints that both limit and enable in varying degrees their opportunities to develop critical models of pedagogy. Teachers cannot escape from their own ideologies, and it is important to understand what society has made of us, what it is we believe in, and how we can minimize the effects on our students of those parts of our sedimented histories that reproduce dominant interests and values. Teachers work under constraints, but within those constraints, they structure and shape classroom experiences and need to be self-reflexive about what interests guide such behavior. Put another way, as teachers, we need to reach into our own histories and attempt to understand how issues of class, culture, gender, and race have left their imprint upon how we think and act. This is particularly important when it comes to working with groups outside of the school, to give them a voice in the control and sharing of curriculum and school policy. The democratization of schooling also involves the need for teachers to build alliances with other teachers. Not only do such alliances lend credence to the extension of democratically informed social relations in other public spheres, they also promote new forms of social relations and modes of pedagogy within the school itself. The cellular structure of teaching is one of the worst aspects of the division of labor. The tailorization of the work process, as it is manifested in schools, represents one of the greatest structural constraints that teachers face. Specifically, it isolates teachers and reifies hierarchical forms of decision-making and authoritarian modes of control. Authoritarian modes of control. To be committed to a radical transformation of the existing society in all of its manifestations always places the individual or the group in the position of losing a job, security, and in some cases friends. Often, as radicals, we are powerless in the face of such repercussions, and the only consolation is to know that others are struggling as well, that the values and ideas one fights for are rooted not only in ethical principles, but in an obligation to the past, to our families, friends, and comrades who have suffered under these dismal systems of oppressions. We also struggle for the future, for our children, and for the promise of a more just society. Radical pedagogy needs a vision, one that celebrates not what is, but what could be, that looks beyond the immediate to the future and links struggle to a new set of human possibilities. This is a call for a concrete utopianism. It is a call for alternative modes of experience, public spheres that affirm one's faith in the possibility of creative risk-taking, of engaging life, so as to enrich it. It means appropriating the critical impulse so as to lay bare the distinction between reality and the conditions that conceal its possibilities. This is the task we face if we would build a society where alternative public spheres will no longer be necessary. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation about conclusion toward a new public sphere. I use the reference Theory and Resistance in Education, a Pedagogy for the Opposition by Henry A. Giroux.